Well, it's another rainy, cold day here in Central Texas, and that has me longing for one of my favorite comfort foods growing up, so I'm going to recreate it from memory. Thanks for joining me today on Susan's Cozy Kitchen. I'm making potatoes au gratin. I have already peeled my potatoes and I have them hanging out here in some water. Now remember, I'm doing this from memory. I'm just sort of making it up as I go along. I don't have a written recipe for this, so bear with me. This is about 4 cups of potatoes once I slice it, and I'm just going to slice these about 1/4 inch thick, and then I will put them back into the water. If you're running a little short on time, you can, after you slice the potatoes, put them in a pot of water and boil them for just a few minutes so that they start softening, so that it doesn't take as long in the oven. I'm not a fan of doing that because I always let them cook too long and then they're mushy and I end up with, I don't know, this cheesy mess instead of potatoes that are nicely sliced with the cheese over it, and you can actually see the slices of potato. The other reason I don't like to do it is that's just more dishes to wash later, and I'm a fan of the least dishes to wash possible. Alright, there are my potatoes sliced. They're in some fresh water just to keep them nice and pretty so that they don't turn dark before I cook them. Time to make the sauce. First thing, butter. I've got about 4 tablespoons of butter, and I'm just going to put that in here and let that start melting. I have this on about medium heat, so that's 1/4 cup of butter. To that, I'm going to add 1/4 cup of flour, and I will cook that for a minute, maybe 2. I want it to just start to get a little hint of color to it. Okay, so there's the butter's melted. Now let's sprinkle in the flour and stir that in. And you want to let your flour cook for at least a minute. It's starting to get a nice little golden color to it. Before I forget to tell you, I have the oven preheating on 400. Here's a cup of milk. Let's whisk this together to make sure that we don't have any lumps from the flour. There shouldn't be, but just to be sure. Okay, it's starting to thicken, so I'm going to add cheese. I grated 4 ounces of Colby Jack, and then I had about 2 ounces of extra sharp cheddar. My mom didn't do, a lot of different cheeses, a lot of fancy cheeses. We were pretty, plain Jane when it came to cooking. And so Colby Jack and cheddar are things that she would have had in her kitchen, and I almost always have them in my kitchen, and so that's what I'm putting in here. It's getting nice and thick. Okay, let's see what this is like. It's a nice basic cheese sauce. It's a little bit thick, so I'm going to add more milk to it to try to thin it out a little bit. This is a little thicker than I wanted. Stir that in. Going to add a little salt. Very little salt because I had salted butter, and then I used self-rising flour because that's what I had in my pantry. And then there's a lot of salt in the cheese, so I only added maybe 1/4 teaspoon of salt. You can add more in, but you can't take it out. So if it needs some more salt, we can always add it at the table. but if it's too salty, then no one's going to eat it. Let's do a few grinds of pepper. And I really love the freshly ground black pepper. It doesn't take a lot, and it adds so much flavor. And then this is something my mom didn't do, but this is my secret ingredient, nutmeg. Not much. In fact, it's so little I can't even measure it. I'm going to put one shake. So 1 shake of nutmeg into the cheese sauce. Not so much that you go, oh wow, this has nutmeg in it, but it's just enough that you taste it and you go, hey, this is really good. What is in that sauce? So be very careful. 1 shake is all you need. Time to put this together. I have a vintage Pyrex baking dish. Try saying that 3 times fast. Anyway, I have my baking dish. I've already sprayed it with oil. On top of that, I'm just going to throw in about 1/4 of the potatoes. I'm going to sprinkle a teaspoon of onion over that, and then I'm going to add another 1/4 of the potatoes. And I'm not going to add any, because I put so much onion in that bottom layer, I'm not going to add any here. Now I'm going to do about 1/3 of the cheese sauce, and yes, you did just see me draw a line across that. I'm going to put about 1/3 of the cheese sauce on here. It's thickened up a lot. At this point, this is a great spot if you want to add some bacon, some ham, just something extra in here. This middle part would be a great place to put it. So keep that in mind if you decide you want to do something extra. Okay, now. There's the rest of the potatoes, just all layered in here. And I'm going to add another little bit of onion, maybe another teaspoon of onion. So if you were doing raw onion, you would want 1/2 an onion, maybe a little bit more, chop it up and add it in with the potatoes. Now I'm going to add the rest of the cheese sauce. And the reason I only did a little bit on the bottom layer, I did 1/3 of it on the bottom layer, and then I'm doing 2/3 on the top layer. And that's just so that the cheese will start at the top and melt down in. Now, before I put this in the oven, I'm going to cover it with foil and seal it as tight as I can so that it will keep the cheese from burning on the top. Into the oven it goes now. And I did have that preheated 400 degrees, and we'll let it cook for about an hour. While I was editing, I found that when I did the original recording, I don't know if it was a technical error or if it was an operator error, but something happened to the sound and I had nothing but static. Rather than try to recreate it or do a voiceover, I thought I would just tell you now what happened. I cooked the potatoes for about 45 minutes, took them out of the oven, removed the foil, and used a fork to check the potatoes to see if they were done yet. They were not soft yet. So that was nothing. Climbing my leg, that hurt. I couldn't figure out why they weren't quite done since they've been cooking at 400 for 45 minutes. Yeah, it's a funny thing, when you don't use your oven for 6 months, you forget that it's not calibrated correctly, and it cooks 25 degrees less than the thermostat says. So I recovered it with foil, turned it up to 450, which would be 425, and let it cook for another ½ hour. When I checked, the potatoes were soft, it was bubbling around the edges, and it was done. So at that point, I put Panko over the top, Popped it back in the oven for another 15 minutes, took it out. It was done, but the panko didn't have any color to it, so I put it under the broiler, let it get slightly brown on top, and then I removed it from the oven and served it for dinner. It was delicious. It was great comfort food. Muffin says, if you like her mommy's video, be sure and give it a big thumbs up. If you haven't already, please subscribe and make sure to hit the notification bell so that you're notified every time I upload a video to YouTube. Thanks so much for watching. God bless. See the kitty? Oh, look at the pretty kitty. Okay, so at that